Trump is being voted out of office and the opportunity for a different trajectory evolves. It's worse than a crime. It's a mistake.
Welcome back to Uncommon Decency. As the Biden team steps in, it's having to deal with a major strategic rivalry with China that had dominated the Trump era. But only weeks before its inauguration, the new American administration was blindsided by the EU signing of the investment agreement of China. At a time when China's human rights records in Xinjiang worsens, and given the rising tensions in Hong Kong, the deal has been, to say the least, very controversial.
Now, we've invited two noted critics of the deal, so forgive us if at times we strike the tone of a Xi Jinping advocate. And that was only lest the whole episode became a big fat Communist Party of China bash fest.
Don't forget to subscribe on your podcast platform, to give us a like and a review. It helps us tremendously to reach out to so many more of you, and it gives us a motivation to keep getting fantastic guests every week for you. We are very pleased to have with us two China watchers to discuss the issue of the Chinese investment agreement with the European Union. François Godement, you're a historian by trade and you focus on China and East Asia. You're a senior advisor on China for French think tank Institut Montaigne and a non-resident fellow associate at Carnegie. We invite our listeners to go on Institut Montaigne's website to catch up with what you've written because it's very thorough and very insightful on what the conversation we're going to have right now. Reinhard Bütikofer, you're a German MEP, you're part of the European Greens. You studied Sinology as a student, and throughout your career, you've kept close attention to China, and you are now the president of the Delegation for Relations with the People's Republic of China and on the Committee of Foreign Affairs. Thank you, both of you.
My pleasure. But for full disclosure, I should add that I do not speak Mandarin.
Well, that's fine. The conversation is strictly in English. So to get us started, you can give us a bit of an overview of this agreement, the philosophy of the agreement, its architecture, as well as maybe a bit of a little bit of a history behind it. What's in it for China? What's in it for the EU? Why did the Commission go with this agreement, the kind of last-minute rush? Because, both of you have been pretty vocal against it. François, you've called it overpowered and oversold. What motivates our position? And again, if you could go through the philosophy and history of the agreements.
I actually wrote it was oversold and underpowered, which I think is the description. Look, if the US was signing an investment deal, whether under Donald Trump or under a new president, it would just be saying, hey, we signed it because it's a good deal. It's in our interest regarding investment. It wouldn't say it has saved the free world. If Japan was signing a deal, it wouldn't be making those claims either. It's a peculiar European ambition to pretend that every agreement that it signs represents its values and is in an advance of values. That may be possible or easy, if you're dealing with Japan or even if you're dealing with South Korea. I don't underestimate the difficulties even there. But here we're dealing with China, with the People's Republic of China under Xi Jinping. So I think one of the reasons that the debate has heated up is that the EU has attempted to claim too much for it. Now, what I hear is that a lot of public officials in the EU, in the Commission, particularly in DG Trade, are now busy backpedaling and saying, hey, come on, we're not going to change the world. We know we're not going to achieve all the structural changes we need with China. We just progressed on the view, and hey, we have enforcement, and hey, we're going to take a lot of other measures to try and defend our interest facing China. So, there are two ways to look at this. And the first, I think, would be, it's been 7 years of pretty sterile talks and sometimes absence of talks, I think 35 rounds with the Chinese, and they moved in only at the last minute. Was it the last minute because the EU itself had set a deadline? Mrs. van der Leyen even had said that if the agreement wasn't reached by the end of 2020, the strategic agenda of cooperation would be in question with China, a horrible threat, you can imagine, for the Chinese leader. I'm joking, of course. Or is it because we were in between two US administrations, because the Chinese have a good reason to worry about better coordination, more achievement from the next administration, at least less disorganization, and promises of coordination with allies? I leave you to decide this. So we should discuss the agreement at two levels. One is this broad strategic level, and it even includes values, environment, labor standards, and when it goes for China, it goes pretty far, human rights abuses, and so forth, and how does the agreement, which claims it defends values, addresses it. The other one is as we would address any kind of practical trade or investment agreement, with one little problem. Up to now, the Commission has not published what should be the core of the agreement. That is the list of sectors opened or closed, the reservations that are made on these openings. Reportedly 150 pages of it. We just have rumors about it. We don't have accurate information.
Well, Reinhard, you're a German MEP, so you're supposed to be seeing the full agreement. Maybe you have a better insight on the text.
It is obvious that Germany, in particular, the Chancellor, played an exceptional role in pulling this off. I would describe the events of the last decade of December last year as a kind of halfway friendly takeover of the final negotiations by the Chancellery, and the Commission played just second fiddle for the decisive days. But I would also like to go back a little bit and give some context. When the Council agreed on the negotiating mandate about 7 years ago, that was a completely different China that we were dealing with, or that we had in mind. Those were the days when people still believed in convergence, economic and even political convergence between the West and China. We have long lost that hope. That was the days when every conversation on the relationship between the EU and the PRC was focusing on strategic cooperation and win-win goals. Today, we have a different understanding, and this is what the experience that we have made with Xi Jinping's China boils down to. It is still a China with which we try to cooperate, a China with which we have to compete, but it is also a systemic rival. And this has not been sufficiently captured in the comprehensive agreement on investment. In those days long past, you could have imagined that compartmentalization of China policy could work. So on one hand, on one weekend, you would give your Sunday sermon about human rights and everything. And then during the following week, you would go back to business and promote trade and investment. But with a systemic rival, it's impossible to pursue the rivalry on Monday, and for the rest of the week, you forget about it. You can cooperate as a systemic rival, but you have to do it in a different way, and you cannot, I repeat that, pursue a stovepipe approach or a silo approach to the relationship. And this basically caught up with us in the result of these negotiations. But I don't want to just look at the angle of values and the critical remark that François has made. I'm not sure whether I would share that completely. I would certainly argue from my point of view that such an agreement should reflect our values. And in this particular case, that comes to the question of forced labor. I think that's where human rights and where economic concerns intersect. Are we willing to accept that China is rampantly using forced labor, in particular in Xinjiang, but also in other parts of the country? Do we accept that as a normal part of an economic relationship for values reasons, but also for economic reasons that pertain to fair competition? I think we should reject that proposition. But more broadly, I would not restrict the conversation, as I said, to that one angle. I would also look at European interests. For me, the deal is questionable also under that angle. Interests that I would like to look at fall into two categories. Economic interests, in particular industrial policy interests. Does this investment agreement serve the purpose of strengthening the renaissance of European industry, the modernization, the digital transformation, the green transformation of European industry? But there's also another layer, which is the geopolitical interests. And today, as Dmitry Trenin has said from Carnegie Moscow, geoeconomics follows geopolitics, not the other way around. So just to narrow the view on whether we get a little more market access, whether there might be slight improvements with regard to a level playing field issues, that is not an adequate measurement. We have to look at the geopolitical implications. And unfortunately, I would say to conclude this deal in this way at this moment has handed China a major geopolitical victory, and we shouldn't have done that.
So let me push back a little bit on so you said that the deal should be criticized because of the standards on human rights, on labor and whatnot. But as it currently stands, the relationship between the EU and China is very unequal, unbalanced. And the EU hasn't been able the past few years to change China's behavior on human rights and forced labor and whatnot. Let me play a little bit devil's advocate. We're probably not going to be able to change China's behaviors on those issues in the future. But at least, from my understanding, this deal makes the life for European companies in China a lot easier, allowing them to balance the relationship between the EU and China. I think this is the kind of best devil's advocate for this agreement that can be made. What would both of you respond to this? Maybe François first and then Reinhard.
First of all, the agreement addresses values which fall under the heading of sustainable development. And only that. It's part of the new generation of supposedly WTO plus agreements, except that WTO arbitration practices have never really recognized these issues as subject to really binding and sanctioned arbitration. So in essence, whoever you sign it with, it's quite a voluntary act. And it's only there that you find issues such as labor and forced labor. There is, in the 70 published pages of the text, there is only one mention, or actually twice, but it's the same mention, just in passing, of the UN Declaration of Human Rights and nothing more. Labor is there because obviously it's linked to economics, to business, and that's the justification for including it. And what the mystery we have there is that China has agreed in principle to extraordinary concessions. For example, the commitment to fight climate change, okay, but also to fight forced labor is on page 1 of the published text. that's unheard of. You will appreciate the difference between theory and practice if on climate change, for example, you note that just today, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China officially declared it would not consider cooperation on climate change with countries that criticize its internal affairs, or what it deems to be its internal affairs. So what is affirmed on the one hand as a principle and seems like a Chinese concession is denied right away by an official declaration. On forced labor, it is true that the Europeans have wrung from China, have obtained from China lip service declarations. But when you know the degree of depth of Chinese commitments, you cannot fail to read the sentence that has been agreed for the text that just says that the two parties will endeavor to essentially arrive at a commitment on forced labor. These are actually two ILO conventions. Endeavor means make your best efforts. And as if that was not enough, in the text is added on their own initiative. That is, without a dialogue, without being prodded, and knowing the past record of Chinese commitments, we know that if something is not precisely inked with deadlines, with a sanctioning process, it's as if nothing had been said. I was going to say that if you go back to China's commitment on joining WTO, that's 2001, it's 20 years ago now, almost. It was already promising to solve issues related to subsidies, to state enterprises, and so on. Very little changed during that period on this front. On the substance of the agreement, again, we don't know yet exactly what the companies are winning. We surmise that some people in the auto sector will get reassurance they can have electric car factories, but the language I've seen so far is extremely conditional. It's not at all a freedom to invest. It's true in some health sectors, for example. It's partially true for telecom and internet services, but most likely with joint ventures. And many of the other supposedly open sectors that will be listed by the agreement, we're going to find out that they were already liberalized either in a trade deal with the US, that's the case for financial services, or because the China itself, when it has developed a sector, when it has very powerful champions inside China, then it creates an opening. So we are probably, but I'm saying this conditionally, going to find that there is much less than meets the eye when we finally see the actual list of opening. That would be my answer.
Reinhard, what do you have to say about the devil's advocate case I made and François' response?
Well, I would say you're the best devil's advocate I've met yet, and I've discussed with Sabine Weyand, who's a very formidable defender of the deal, but not even she was saying that this deal makes the life of German or French or overall European industry much easier. That would be selling glitter for gold. And you should take note of the fact that the reaction from industry has been pretty lukewarm. I've spoken to people from business associations who privately would say very, very clearly that they're disappointed with the deal. Of course, there are a couple of major corporations, in particular the automotive industry, that have welcomed this very, very much. But that's not the broadly shared view of the business community, and that's for good reasons. Some of the promises for opening up are just recycled promises. So the Chinese are answering our promise fatigue with recycling the promises. For instance, some of the joint venture regulations that are being dropped now would be dropped because of the foreign investment law anyhow, starting 2022. And this deal will hardly be ratified before 2022. So substantively, in these cases, we don't win anything additionally. Then there are some promises that are being counteracted by other regulatory measures. So on one hand, the deal says there will be more access in the financial sector. On the other hand, localization mandates that the Chinese government is trying to put in place would make it completely impossible for the European banks that already only hold 0.2% of the market share to even sustain their presence in China. They would be driven out of the country. Formally an opening, de facto just the opposite. Then there are, François already alluded to that, there are some interesting strings attached here and there. So for instance, when you look at the market opening for the new energy vehicle sector, you will find that there is a provision saying you can get such a permit for accessing that market if there is proof that in the province where you want to invest, the pre-existing production capacity has been fully exhausted. How can you prove such a case? And how can you prove to a bureaucracy that pursues political imperatives from the CCP that they should not use that against you? There's just one exception when this restriction does not apply, and that is if you're able to invest more than 1 billion in one place. Now, that may result in an opening to some big OEMs, but what's the industrial policy consequence? I could imagine that this fits neatly with a Chinese dual circulation strategy that is indeed aiming also at making major international MNCs dependent on the Chinese market. Some of the German automotive companies are already very dependent on the Chinese market. And I have described that as a Gulliver goes to China mechanism, where those major investors would then possibly be forced to integrate even more deeply with the Chinese industrial ecosystem, thus rupturing to some degree the innovation partnership that they have enjoyed in the past with the SMEs and their supply chains around Europe. So what industrial policy impacts would that have in the medium and long term? These are concerns. Then there is no change whatsoever with regard to procurement. And in a country where the government plays such a big role, procurement is a huge issue, very disappointing. And some of the level playing field issues that seem to be juicy, maybe, and of which the Commission is very proud, saying nobody's ever endeavored to negotiate such provisions. And I guess that's even true. At least Trump didn't try in that regard when he negotiated his phase one deal. But what it's worth is depending on the implementation mechanism. And that implementation mechanism looks weak to me. To quote Abraham Lincoln, it looks weak as a soup made from the shadow of a pigeon that died of starvation. So why is industry not happy because of that?
Yeah, well, this is really helpful, Reinhard, and it really ties nicely into what
François was saying earlier in terms of, we've never, the record the only record that we can work with in terms of China's market policies is that only when they've established a dominance in a certain sector is it possible for them to make them, open that sector up to competition. And even then, the conditions are very, very unbalanced. But I want to use that as a segue to turn into what I believe both of you may already have in the back of your minds, which is how this plays into the transatlantic relationship and building a common front against China, which was certainly Joe Biden's major pitch to his European allies just before he was met with this fait accompli of before being sworn into the Oval Office, finding himself with a totally new makeup, a geopolitical makeup of the world, where the Europeans seem to want to signal that they're getting closer to the Chinese. And as François was saying earlier, not only are the commercial gains minor, the commercial gains that we've may have made at the huge cost of the human rights sellout, essentially, we could have made even better gains on a trilateral setting. So, right, the argument goes. And my question is, not necessarily in the sort of, what's your case and what's the devil's advocate's case, but what do you think, where do we go forward in terms of building this transatlantic approach to China? What are the channels going to be like? What are you looking forward to, Reinhard, in terms of working with our American allies to hold China accountable for its abuses? What do you think that relationship is going to look like in the next 4 years? And maybe for this time we'll start with François and then we'll go to Reinhard.
I think we should be measured in looking at the impact across the Atlantic. There's been US shock at realizing that China could score a public diplomacy victory by proving that Europe will sign a separate deal. On the other hand, that was always the case previously. And the European response is that, well, there was the January 2020 US-China phase 1 trade agreement, which included some investment provisions. And so some of the language that the Commission uses to justify the agreement is to say, hey, on some areas, either we got even or we arrived at the level of concessions that the US had gained. Second, the new administration will realize that apart from words on values, words on leveling the playing field, and especially when it concerns items under sustainable development, the gains are either minimal or purely verbal. So they will downplay the agreement and they will come back to other measures. The EU itself is busy saying this is only part of our policy towards China. We have defensive tools which we have to improve. We have to coordinate on issues such as tech export and others with the US. It, of course, depends a lot on what the political balance in Germany will be, because this is the economy that is both the largest and the most deeply entangled with China. So there may be disagreements on what is commonly called decoupling. Should it be only for national security? Should it be for critical technologies? Should it go even further, for example, to sanctions following Chinese behavior over, say, Xinjiang, Uyghurs, or Hong Kong, or any other issue you could name? There are plenty of crises that are looking to us, by the way, for the next few years. So I don't think this is going to be a tug of war between the new administration and Europe. I think the US administration will look at this as a failed occasion to get a better deal, indeed, in a coordinated way, but we'll move on. And I also think China will move on. One real danger for Europe is the agreement isn't even signed yet. In theory, it's only subject now to legal scrubbing, but with the Chinese, the legal scrubbing, that's a pretty serious issue. And we can see the temptation for China to move back towards the US and to tell the Europeans, well, that's it. I mean, take it or leave it. And then there will be the obstacle of ratification. We haven't talked about that.
Well, my assessment pretty much goes in the same direction. I I do strongly believe that we should make every and any effort to create a common front, or since this pertains to China, we might even say a united front, do some united front work from our side. And we wasted a great opportunity of demonstrating that not just to the new Biden administration, but also to the Chinese and to the world more broadly as they are watching what we are doing. I recall when RCEP was signed, people started commenting that obviously ASEAN was not willing to wait for Biden. Now the echo is, well, neither are the Europeans. They are welcoming Biden by sticking the middle finger to him. And all the arguments that are being made by Commission, and interestingly, neither the Chancellor nor President Macron, the two erstwhile promoters of this deal, have cared for publicly explaining their policy. They have left that to Commission, and my impression is that President von der Leyen is not particularly happy with the subservient role that the Commission played in the last phase of the deal to these national leaders. But the world will recognize that for Europe, it is still either Wandel durch Handel, the old German belief, the old German gospel. We will change our trading partners, may they be authoritarian or even totalitarian, through trading with them. That's the old convergence strategy. Or it's even worse. It's maybe a declinist view saying, look, China is going to grow stronger. The West is not going to be able to unite, so maybe we take what we get. At least it's not the stance of a self-confident geopolitical actor. It's been organized in a way as to ignore the geopolitical dimension. And when you closely listen to Commission, if they can run away from the geopolitical arguments, they will immediately do so. And if they find themselves forced to answer, I usually get a very interesting argument. It says, but this is expressing strategic autonomy. Now, you can obviously shoot yourself in the foot autonomously, but I would put the question this way. Is it really more important to demonstrate to Washington that we're willing to be autonomous than demonstrating to China that we're willing to team up with our transatlantic partners? Here, the leaders made the wrong decision. They chose the wrong priority. And this is having a negative impact in the US. I've spoken to so many people, strong Atlanticists from the other side of the pond, that were, as François said, stunned. They wouldn't have imagined that this would happen, and this creates suspicion. Is the European offer for collaboration just nice words? Of course, it is a fact that there is a lack of trust. And I've often heard around Brussels this one-liner saying, but what if in 4 years it goes the other way in Washington? So the negative impact that Trump has had is not just the superficial impact of his policies, but a very very deep-going undermining of transatlantic reliability and transatlantic trust. But Having said that, it should be our preeminent effort to create trust where we have an opportunity. I'm not saying we should have asked Uncle Joe for his okay. We can take our own decisions but it would have been an important political signal to say to him and to the Chinese and to the world, we will not waste any opportunity of trying to move forward together. And the fact that Trump operated unilaterally is not an excuse for doing the same at exactly the moment when Trump is being voted out of office and the opportunity for a different trajectory evolves. That's really, it's worse than a crime. It's a mistake.
So I have one question, which is a bit beyond the question of China and more about the question of perhaps one of the EU's weaknesses, which is every time we have a partner or a frenemy or an enemy pressuring the EU and especially the German car-making sector, it seems that Germany and then the EU starts caving in and accepting every demand. And we just talked about Trump, and to a large extent, it was quite a bit of a caricature at some point. But every time Trump was unhappy with a development within the EU, the very first thing he would do is threaten a tariff on German cars. So as much as the German car making sector is a real strength for Germany and for Europe, its strength to some extent has become a weakness. How do we limit this Achilles heel of Europe? Maybe François first.
I have a tongue-in-cheek answer for that one, because as it happens, the Trump administration made a lot of threats and nasty words about the German auto industry and the German surplus, but the only actual trade sanctions that were adopted concern wine, alcohol, perfume, handbags, luxury goods, stuff that France makes. So there was a bit of a, threaten Germany, but punish France. And that is part of the picture. Currently, yes, the auto industry, of course, weighs a lot. There is talk, and Mrs. Merkel herself has alluded to the need for the usefulness of the agreement for Europeans to procure high-tech goods from China, which sounds quite incredible to say, but I think you've got to understand it in a different way. It's the wish not to be dependent solely on tech from the US for the digital age, for platforms. It's a pretty pessimistic assessment, in fact. I am not sure that part of the agreement is very successful, because from what I hear, the opening will actually be quite limited. And of course, there is a lot of fear. China will, of course, try to get in the most critical sector. It has not abandoned its fight, for example, for Huawei. So this is not an area where we should diverge strongly with the US. We do have issues about the digital tax to solve. I'm happy to have seen today that at least the French and with Yann Etelen, the French Minister of the Economy, with Yann Etelen, seems to have agreed to a resolution of the issue within OECD. It will be a welcome solution for this tax issue. But again, exactly like Reinhard said, this is the kind of run-of-the-mill business debates and negotiations we have with the US. We've had them for 50 years. We've always had them. They are nothing compared with the fundamental structural divergences that we have with China. So it would be extraordinary even if we don't solve 100% of the quarrels, with an administration in the US that says it wants to improve a relationship with allies and coordinations, we don't arrive at resolution. So I am not one who thinks that there are never second thoughts, that there are not doubts long terms about the possible US isolationism. I don't neglect the fact that Americans are pretty skeptical about Europe's defense efforts and see us as, not standing up to what we should do. but I don't think that this administration should see, how should I say, another upsurge of these issues.
So right now, you talk a little bit about the impact of the auto industry on making this deal. What can you say about the general point of the influence of the automaking industry on Germany and therefore on the European Union?
Well, I would say you put that very succinctly. Our economic strength, our pillar of economic strength, which is the automotive industry, of which at least 1 in 7 jobs in Germany depends, and many more jobs around Europe. That pillar of strength is our greatest weakness. I don't know what the Chinese translation would be of this American saying that if you got them by the balls, their hearts and minds will follow, but they certainly know how to apply that lesson. And this is one of the reasons why deciding these issues according to a merely national logic, according to geoeconomic nationalism, is just behind the curve. Unless we integrate the German concerns in the broader European and transatlantic context, we're prone to be pressured and to be blackmailed. And it was a memorable moment at a public forum organized by Handelsblatt about a year ago or so, where the Chinese ambassador, when the conversation touched upon Huawei, he said, well, just hypothetically, thought experiment, what would you say if we came to the conclusion in China that the German automotive industry threatens China's national security? We're not even thinking about it, but just what would you think? I mean, a more obvious threat hasn't been made recently. And this certainly has quite some traction. But it is, and again, there is also a basis for not giving into that, because if you look at the wider picture, the German Mittelstand is much more skeptical, much less dependent. They have been more circumspect with allowing China to take control of some of their technologies, and they're more reluctant to allow this one market to become so overwhelmingly important for them. Of course, I understand that the chancellor wants to defend the automotive interests, our industry is in a deplorable state because they have wasted minimum 15 years when they could have taken technology leadership. They were completely convinced that they would be strong enough to take the lead whenever it would be necessary, and they lost the moment. And of course, for the German industry, the problem with China is this: they're very strong in the combustion technology segment of the market, but that's not going to be the future. Their role in the new energy vehicle segment is minute. So unless they can grow their presence in that sector of the market, their future looks pretty dire. This is a motivation that certainly influenced the negotiations. And I am realist enough to say, okay, you have to pay a certain price if that's the situation in which you're in. It's just not the case that you have to pay any price. And I don't think that the chancellor has understood that.
Well, we're reaching the end of our conversation. I do want to follow up on this question of transparency and how we've seen this deal emerge from a very a very unsavory at times interplay of private interests and very opaque bureaucratic kind of machinations. But just to kind of stretch this a little further, there was a larger point that was made by Reinhard at the start of our conversation about not only the car makers' influence in German foreign policy, EU foreign policy, but about the way that Germany, played its hand in this whole deal. I mean, you were mentioning at the start, Reinhard, that Merkel's chancellery kind of took over, right, the negotiations at the last possible minute to squeeze out the council presidency, and everything was done in a very opaque way with a mandate that came down 7 years ago with a very sort of tactless timing also. I mean, you got to remember that no one really was opposed to the 7-year negotiation being halted after COVID. Everyone understood that there wasn't going to be a meaningful Leipzig summit. Everyone understood that COVID changed the ballgame entirely on the EU-China partnership. And my question isn't so much about car makers specifically, as important though that is about Germany's larger role here. And I think a lot of people are souring on Germany's hand in EU foreign policy, and they see it as, I mean, François will be able to speak to this, but yes, there is a certain French component to this outlook where, this really ties nicely into strategic autonomy, and there are people, a lot of people in France who want the EU to play just whatever role, but a role in carving out a space in between the US and China. But Germany certainly has had the upper hand in bringing this deal to fruition. Are you concerned at all, perhaps starting with François and then turning back to Reinhard, that Germany is simply too powerful a player in EU foreign policy?
I mean, you need to face the fact that Germany has the largest economy, has the largest component of trade and investment with China. So its power is not an inheritance from Chancellor Bismarck. It's real and actual. If I take a French hat for a second, I'm struck by two things. From Germany, the subtext for the agreement seems to be, it's the best we could get. It's a pretty pessimistic assessment, in fact. From France, there is some, positive stuff about strategic autonomy, but essentially, Mr. Macron has persuaded successfully after years Chancellor Merkel to go in for more financial and budgetary integration, to go in for the semi-mutualization of EU loans after COVID. And the French want to think it's only the first step on a road that will lead to a more closely integrated Europe. How is he going to take the lead of a disparate no coalition that involves countries that would be as different as Sweden, for example, as Poland, and possibly Italy? It's very difficult. I think I am not privy to Mr. Macron's thoughts on this, but I think the notion that if you break the Franco-German cooperation on such an issue, you're running a big risk in general for European affairs must have been very strong. It is true that the French interest in the deal is not absent, and you will find industries which place hope on the deal, for example, in the bio and pharma sector, or of course the luxury sector wants to protect itself. But the interests are not huge. But it's this that has played a role, and I think the Germany genuinely feels itself extremely vulnerable, first to Chinese blackmail, and second to missing out on the digital revolution, being the champion of the industrial export age and not being well placed enough, torn, as Mrs. Merkel has sometimes said, between the US and China, between Silicon Valley and, shall we say, Haidian in Beijing.
Certainly the economic way that Germany plays a role, but I would say in this case, maybe an even bigger role played the fact that Germany had an agenda. The chancellor had an agenda there. and nobody else really had one. The French side, forgive me for saying this, but they spoke differently out of two corners of their mouth. The Polish complained, as did the Italians, the Spanish, the Swedish, the Dutch, the Belgians, the Luxembourgish, the Estonians, and the Lithuanians. But neither of those wanted to risk the double wrath of both Mrs. Merkel and President Xi Jinping. So even though there were quite some misgivings and quite some hesitations, and still different countries expressed their dissatisfaction with how it all went, nobody dared standing up and as François said, organizing a no front. I would think that this could possibly be described as the last battle cry. If I try to give this a positive interpretation, I would say this is the last battle cry of the old German attitude vis-a-vis China, where we were always happy of having a very special relationship, a relationship that benefited Germany beautifully in the trade realm. That was founded on a very peculiar sort of economic fit, a high level of complementarity between the German economy and the Chinese economy. We produced for the Chinese the luxury cars and the high-tech products that they craved for, and they supplied our market with pricey commodities. There was hardly much competition. That was different from the situation of other European economies like Poland or even Italy. But since China has started moving up through the value chain, and that became apparent when they published their Made in China 2025 strategy at the latest, or when they happened to buy KUKA, that robotics firm from Augsburg. The German engineers began understanding that the Chinese were out to eat the Germans' lunch. And that changed attitudes. And I would say, if you look at the broader picture, Germany has, as the Chinese have tried to become more German technology-wise, the Germans became more European politically, because they found themselves more in a situation that was comparable, beginning to be comparable to the experience of their neighbors. So Germany was part of the investment screening initiative together with France and Italy. It has supported the anti-dumping scheme that we put in place. It promised to support the international procurement instrument. So there was a tendency of Germany coming closer together with the rest of the EU. And this deal now is an instance of the old German Sonderweg in the relationship with China that may go away with the chancellor. I'm not completely sure. And she went to quite some lengths to enforce that point. She even managed to use her presidency to slow down the legislative work in the Council on the International Procurement Instrument because she wanted to do China a favor. So this is, interestingly, a point where we should watch out very closely, because, of course, Commission now says we have our unilateral measures, our defensive instruments that we can, of course, use at will. We have the freedom to legislate. But if one or two big players around Europe put their foot on the brake, then all of that will not happen. I hope that my optimistic interpretation that this was the last clarion call of yesterday's trumpet could be true. We'll see.
Thank you very much for this very insightful and thorough analysis, Reinhard and François. I think we can conclude on that note, and thank you very much for tuning in.
Great. Well, the MEP and Mr. Godement are out. What did you think of this episode, François?
I've always really interesting because we had probably two of the most knowledgeable people on the European-China relations and on the agreement specifically. Obviously, we invited two critics of the deal, so we had to push back a little bit. In one scenario, we don't get a deal, and we still get no capacity to influence China's record on human rights. In the other scenario, which is the scenario we seem to have right now, at least we get a quick buck, but we still have no capacity to change China's record on human rights. So it's kind of a very cynical case for this. But I think it kind of leads more generally to the question of, can democracies trade with autocracies or regimes which are very far away from our democratic standards? Is it possible, to paraphrase the late Yitzhak Rabin, is it possible to trade like there's no human rights violation and scrutinize human rights violation like there's no trade deal? And I think that's something we have to keep thinking about, because we all agree that China's human rights record is horrendous, and there's a lot of terrifying stuff coming from the camps in Xinjiang and whatnot. But we also realistically can't cut all trade deals whatsoever. And so I thought some of the criticism coming from the United States was understandable, because the timing was horrific. It was clearly a communication victory for Beijing weeks before the inauguration of Joe Biden. However, I thought some of the criticism was also a bit unfair, because the conditions the Europeans managed to get from the Chinese are pretty much identical to the conditions the Americans managed to extract from the Chinese under Donald Trump after the trade spats. So, I think, as much as I understand the feeling of betrayal, there's also kind of a leveling of relations between the EU and China, which had already been done by the United States a few months before that.
Yeah, I'll pick you up on your first point first, and what I think one of the issues that we tended to miss, I think, in the episode, albeit I think at some point François Godement mentioned it, is that what we've seen unravel with this deal is the longstanding EU policy to at least seek to what's been called compartmentalizing economic policy, and kind of, as you mentioned, trying to parse out the trade areas from the human rights. And I think there was a very interesting piece in Politico just in the wake of the deal that essentially was reporting on how everyone agrees that this deal marks the end of that kind of policy of compartmentalizing, because everyone understands that you cannot, at this stage in China's development of its sort of authoritarian, economically nationalistic state, there's no way that you can say, okay, well, listen, we're gonna stitch together a trade deal on this front, and then at the same time on these other fora, such as the ILO or other multilateral settings, we're still gonna call you out. Because essentially what happens is, with this deal, there was one small effort made to get China to sign up to a few remaining protocols by the International Labor Organization, the ILO, which I think is based in Geneva. There was a small effort made that I think was pushed primarily by Macron and Frank Riester, I think it made. And so I think, and they came out to be in the days leading up to the deal. Macron and his minister cut out the more kind of China hawkish figure of all the EU leaders, and their strategy was to, listen, let's at least get China to sign up to a standard of protocols that it is going to be the ILO's job to enforce, to make sure that it lives up to, and at the very least we can save face. And what happened is that they did that, but at the same time they forgot to even mention in the deal the growing evidence. I think there's been a number of reports by human rights organizations over the years, a number of reports that have started using the term of slavery as applied to Xinjiang and the forced labor camps in that part of China for the Uyghur minority. And the deal itself, the draft of the deal, doesn't even mention what's going on in Xinjiang, or at least it doesn't mention it explicitly. So you have this. The EU was still believed that it could, okay, well, let's do this sort of very realpolitik deal with China that is going to allow for some market access for our companies and leave the human rights issues for different fora. And that simply didn't work. People saw in the way that the media as a whole is covering this deal as a sellout. People are seeing that the EU is giving up on human rights as a way to advance market access. And so you can no longer separate the two. You have to sacrifice one in service of the other.
Oh, I agree. And there's always a principle of reality. In the end, might is right, sadly. And it's a lot easier to lecture smaller countries on human rights when you're the European Union than lecturing China, because China is just so central to our economic system. I think there's another point which was interesting was both of them were very frank, especially Reinhard Bütikofer was very wasn't sure what to expect, but his frankness was very was great for a podcast because he didn't dodge any question. And on the question of the German automaking lobby, it's a very powerful sector. It employs, I think, 1 in 7 Germans, and it has become so powerful that it's a weakness. Yeah.
And I thought your question to him, François, was really piercing and almost almost kind of in a landmine type of fashion. And I think he treaded carefully when he was answering your question about the car industry. Let's just remind our audience that here comes a leading figure. I mean, over the years, my understanding is Bütikofer rose up nationally first to be the president of the German Greens, the Grüne, political force to be reckoned with. It's not as if we're not talking about the French Greens nor the Spanish Greens. We're talking about the German Greens. And your question was, well, look, we have the car industry. And when you were asking that question, the thought in the back of my mind was one of the main industries that has a lot to gain from this deal is the electric vehicles industry, which is also primarily German, but it's kind of, in a way, lobbies different. So obviously I can imagine that the EV industry would find a lot to love in someone like Bütikofer, but he didn't necessarily pander to them. He said, that it's yes, it is an industry that has an oversized influence in Germany, and he was, as you said, he was pretty frank. But sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, no, but I think there's no easy answer because it's a strength for Germany, but at the same time it's become a weakness, and it's very hard. How do you manage to limit the liability it causes for Germany and therefore for the EU? I think there's no easy answer, and there's not even a start of a reflection on this. And I think that's something we should start thinking about: is how do we keep a successful German industry without making it a liability for the rest of Europe? And that's maybe a line of thinking we should keep for further episodes.
Yeah, and it was also very interesting just to kind of wrap up with this is I was also rather surprised by Godment's answer to this, because he said, look, Germany is just an economic hegemon in Europe, and you have to adjust to it. You have to recognize that it will leverage its power in trade negotiations, and that much I can concede, I can understand. But the larger point that we perhaps could have gotten into in this conversation is that it isn't just about the car making industry. It's generally the way that I feel is that Germany has co-opted much of the economic diplomacy for that the EU uses to advance its interests. When you look at chambers of commerce, for instance, the European Chamber of Commerce in Beijing, the European Chamber of Commerce in Washington, these institutions are all heavily populated by German businessmen and German lobbyists. Germany has been very, very cunning in the way that it's deployed its rhetoric and its sort of its own image to speak on behalf of Europe as a whole. And I think a lot of that extends to the think tank world as well. When you think of the people that you yourself speak to at the Atlantic Council and whatnot, Germany has a hefty presence in Washington in the think tank world. Obviously, the German Marshall Fund is a chief example, but not the only one. And I think we could have stretched some of that argument out into the larger question of Germany as the almost like the de facto voice of Europe on economic matters. And I think that on that issue specifically, there's some resentment. I think a lot of people resent that Germany has tries to speak as the European voice.
Well, that might be a great episode in the future. That's something we should keep in mind. But anyways, thank you very much for tuning in. you can please like and subscribe and review the show. It helps us tremendously reach out to a greater audience, and it helps us have the extra motivation, which keeps us getting fantastic guests for all of you. So again, thanks for tuning in, and see you next week.